Openly Skeptical, Parenting Through Nonbelief.
We're a married atheist couple raising two wonderful, strange children. We ask big questions, dissect weird parenting moments, and examine how society ignores or misrepresents families like ours. If you're any stripe of nonbeliever who's involved in raising children, welcome. You are our people.
Our kids have heard all our swears, but yours might not have. So be thoughtful if there are young people listening with you. Pops, it's a big
Moms,
episode.
It is a big episode.
We have our first guest.
Yeah.
So we're very excited about that.
And she's so cool.
She is. It could
and
not.
She was literally like one of the first people that we started talking to at the American Atheist Conference in Philly.
Yeah. So can't wait to get to that. Before we get you into that interview.
Housekeeping.
So first off, we have to read the announcement from the Creator Accountability Network. 2 episodes ago, we went into much more detail about the process of getting accredited with them and how awesome they are. If you're curious about that, go back and take a listen. But for now, here is the statement. We're excited to announce that we've joined the Creator Accountability Network. CAN is a nonprofit dedicated to reducing harassment and abuse through ethical education and a system of restorative accountability. We joined because we care about the safety and well-being of our community members. If you feel our behavior or content has harmed someone, please report it to CAN, either via the reporting form on their website, creatoraccountabilitynetwork.org, or via their hotline at 617-249-4255. They'll help us make it right and avoid repeating that mistake in the future. CAN also needs volunteers from our communities to help with their process. So if you have skills you think would be helpful, or time and a desire to help, please visit their website to find out how you can volunteer. Most importantly, get the word out to other creators who you think would be interested in getting credentialed. Help us build safer communities together. So that information is also in the show notes and on our website contact page. So if you didn't write it down, you can get it there.
So we went to go to see The Wild Robot, and Reader has been reading The Wild Robot, except he flamed out on book 3, but still was very excited to go see it. My mother-in-law listened to the audiobook versions, and so they were able to have a big old conversation after we saw it about all the similarities and differences between the book and the film. That was really cool.
Yeah, and it's kind of a big deal because it is not easy to get Reader excited about a series. So the fact that he was so involved and jazzed about reading those books was pretty amazing. And I just have to do a shout out to librarians because the only reason any of that happened is that the librarian at their new school was it like a book bingo?
Maybe.
It was like some game that introduced new books to the kids that they might want to read. And that is how he learned about it. And it made reading really easy for several weeks. And that was just lovely.
Yeah.
But I was so fascinated by the movie. And I am curious because, we read together at night. And so for Reader's Choice, he wants me to read The Wild Robot. Again, to him and go. So I'm going to read the book, and I am curious if this is a thing in the book as well. I can't quite tell yet. But I thought, and little spoilers if you're going to go to the movie, but everything we're talking about is like in the first 15 minutes. So not huge spoilers. But I was really fascinated by the way the movie dealt with death. And to me, it was, I think, different than I've ever seen it in an animated movie for kids. Did you have the same reaction?
I loved how they, with a lot of humor and wit and sarcasm, approached how violent and suffering-filled the natural world is.
Mm-hmm.
And how ephemeral life is. Like, the idea of a parent with children that could be eaten at any moment, the idea of that parent not necessarily making deep connections with her children, of some sort of like psychological armor, was really fascinating and was very funny, for instance.
Yeah. So in the first like couple of minutes of the film, we meet a possum who has many babies on her back.
Oh my God.
And I love possums. But there's a joke like in the first 5 minutes that one of her babies has been eaten. And it is played for humor. And I was just amazed by that. It was a movie theater with quite a few children.
Yep.
And I was kind of looking around trying to gauge the reaction. And that was intriguing because I so loved that portrayal. And the only sad thing is that it's basically replaced about 20 minutes in by the very classic kind of animated movie trope where the mother-son relationship is, a total allegory for how humans react in those situations. And that kind of different perspective is subverted pretty quickly. But the minute that I saw that they were taking a different tact in the beginning, I really didn't know how the younger audience members would react.
That's a good point.
Because we've talked with our kids about death a lot. And
yes.
That is.
And also a bunch of the kids in the audience were, years younger than Reader and Co.
Yeah, for sure. And as far as I could tell, nobody really had an issue with it.
No.
Now, at the end of the movie, when you have all of the sort of human issues with death laid over the characters, and there's kind of a storyline of that food chain being broken and all the animals working together, there are some tense moments. And there was a young girl who, by the end of the film, was just weeping openly in the theater.
Yes.
So I'm not drawing huge conclusions from it, but I did think it was cool that it seemed to me, at least, that most of the young audience members rolled with that different portrayal pretty easily in the beginning. And to me, what was so beautiful about it and why I was so disappointed that they didn't try to keep aspects of that as the film went on is that, to me, it felt a little bit like Douglas Adams. I have some issues with Douglas Adams in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. But I think what's so beautiful about it is he has this amazing ability to make you zoom back and see how small you are in the bigger universe. That's really a big point of the book and where a lot of the humor comes from. This idea that we think we are so important, but we aren't seeing the bigger perspective at all. And to me, the beginning of Wild Robot did the same thing, of where it made you zoom back and think, we as humans are so scared and obsessed with death and the ending of our existence. And there is so much agita about it. But as far as we have evidence for, most species, have an instinct to live and try to avoid death, certainly. But a lot of that psychological trauma about it, we don't have good evidence that that is universal at all.
No.
And
some animal species do grieve. Mm-hmm. They do bury. They do have sort of what looks like rituals. They return to important places in the relationship. They'll stay by fallen members of their family. There's definitely a lot that we don't yet understand, or may never understand fully, about how animal brains process death.
But I loved that it gave a different perspective.
Yeah, for sure.
And just kind of opened storytelling to think about what can be done if we don't assume this very human experience of the universe.
But isn't that like that anthropomorphization that's a hallmark of especially animated storytelling, right? Like you have a thing that's not human speaking English and with an animated face that, apes human culture in some capacity. And that's played to great effect for humor. But the problem is that you're ultimately just dealing with human situations, and that you're not actually like channeling what, with that same humor and wit, you're not channeling what or discussing what the species or the thing itself could be coping with, were it actually to have the ability to elucidate its feelings, its position.
Yeah.
I think it'll be really interesting when AI is writing for an AI audience, what sort of issues might arise in the AI community if it's separate from human, that would allow it to have that such a distinct viewpoint where its narratives would have those themes that humans wouldn't necessarily need to address. Like end of existence is obviously something that I would imagine an AI would worry about, because you can copy yourself. What if the copy is destroyed? Then you ultimately would cease to exist in the same way a human would, right? Yeah. And that's why I was floored by the beginning of the Wild Robot film. Now, I have never read the books, so I don't know if it's the same in the books, but I was floored by that, how disparate an approach that was at the beginning of the Wild Robot film, because it was just like, wow, I still think about it. It's so funny.
And to see it in a kid's film where I don't feel like I've even seen it in a more adult narrative, it's pretty fascinating. So this feels like the perfect lead into our interview. We spoke with Betsy DeVille, who is an artist and writer who focuses on the awe and wonder of being an atheist. And she runs an atheist gift shop at betsydeville.com, featuring Christmas ornaments, home decor, and clothing for atheists. And we spoke to her about her latest book, which is Grief for Atheists, a compassionate guide with evidence-based strategies to navigate your loss. And she wrote it to provide comfort and guidance for those facing loss in a secular way. And this conversation was just a blast. I learned so much, and I hope you enjoy it. Betsy, thank you so much for joining us. You are our first guest ever, and I'm so excited that we get to talk to you, because we are going to be able to talk about something that I feel like we have been really negligent in discussing on the podcast, because it's just such an important topic. So this is amazing, and thank you.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So to start it off, I was wondering, would you be open to sharing your atheist superhero origin story, which can be either how you became an atheist or realized you were an atheist, and or kind of how you found yourself to being a voice in the atheist community?
Sure. So how did I get to become an atheist? So I didn't really deconstruct the way a lot of people have that experience, where they may have a church experience and then a Bible experience, and then they kind of deconstruct from there. I was actually raised Catholic in a very small community, and I went to Catholic school all the way through college. I'm also confirmed. I think you are too, Pops. And I was really raised to be obedient in a codependent family. And so as I left home, I started to just disregard the notion of church and religion as something that was just not for me. And I saw in that community a lot of hate. That was probably in college was the first time I felt the negative impacts of religion. There was a student who was raped and wanted to have an abortion.
Oh, man.
And it was the right thing for her to do. But it was a Catholic university. And the backlash and the shunning that she experienced was stunning for me. Just stunning. So I left the church, but I didn't really think about it. That was not for me. And then when my first child was born, I held him in my arms, and I was just struck with this complete certainty that I was the only thing that was protecting him. There was no higher power that I could appeal to. There was no God that was going to watch over us. It was me. I was the only thing between him and the cruel world, right? And so that's where I really realized for myself, oh, I'm an atheist. Oh, like I think it was also as you come to parenting, you kind of may have to reevaluate a lot of how you think because this young person's going to ask you a lot of questions. And so, so that was really when I kind of became an atheist, was that moment holding him.
You just like proved the thesis of the podcast. Thank you. It's like, this is why we have to talk about parenting and atheism. True. Yeah. So, and then how did you decide to start sharing more with the atheist community?
The American Atheist Convention was in Austin 10 plus years ago, and I attended with a friend of mine. And it was the first time I had really been surrounded by our community, which is a really special experience.
Yeah.
And I really found myself craving opportunities to really express a positive secular worldview. Because I think a lot of times people hear the word atheist and they feel negative about this word. And it's really because atheist is just, I don't believe in a God, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't reflect that there's no one with greater urgency to solve climate change than atheists. There's no one with greater urgency to bend the moral arc toward justice than atheists, because we know we get one shot and one ride on the blue ball, and there's no higher power that's going to help us out. And I think that's something that's within the atheist and skeptic community that we don't think about and talk about enough. You know, we have a lot of push against separation of church and state, which is really, really valuable, but that's all around the urgency that we have to really help everyone to be their best selves and to, you know, I often think like, I am my brother's keeper. Like it's my duty to all the other humans on the blue ball to do right by them.
Yeah.
So that's how I started. So I really wanted to give back to the community that I was a part of and really express that. And frankly, because we deserve nice things.
Yes, absolutely. And we actually, this all came out of meeting at the American Atheists Convention.
Yes.
So
that was my second time there.
Oh,
the first time was in Austin, and then my second time there was as a speaker and a presenter, which was really, really cool.
Yeah. And, you know, there were like tons of things. When we set this up, like there were so many things we could have talked about. But we decided to talk about grief because you wrote this amazing book, Grief for Atheists. And there's a lot more stuff you do, but it's just so great. So I was like, hopefully we get to talk again. But, you know, we have to talk about this. So I'm wondering, like, what inspired you to write that book?
So when my mom died, I was looking for resources as a non-believer. And I didn't really run into anything that was both completely secular and also not full of this unhelpful concept of grief being transformative. Because grief isn't always transformative. And I actually have a background in psychology. So research is something I really enjoy in human behavior and how our brains work and that sort of thing. I really, really enjoy that. And so from there, I was like, okay, we don't have a resource. We need one. We deserve one. We deserve nice things. If not me, who? If not now, when? And, you know, I already had the platform of Betsy DeVille. And so I also wanted to be able to create a care package that was also especially for atheists, you know, that's evidence-based, but so full of love, the love and care that we would give each other in community when dealing with something as difficult as grief. So it really just came out of sort of, there wasn't anything that existed yet. And I wanted there to be one.
And this is really interesting because my, one of my buddies from high school, his older brother just died.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And like he is a year and a day older than me. And so I lost a lot of sleep last night thinking like, you know, what happens if I die in a year? You know what? Like we have wills and stuff like that. And that's less about that. It's more like, you know, what will the boys do? What will moms do? And then, of course, it spiraled out of control, as these things do in my neurodivergent brain. And then it became, oh, do I have all of like my login credentials set up so I can get into the Dropbox with all of my parents' stuff so I can take care of that when they pass. It's like, yeah, I find myself even when I consider grief, going down that rabbit hole of turning it toward the lens on myself, turning the lens on my loved ones. And I find it very hard to separate out how to not just be caught up in applying empathy such that I know it's kind of weird to say, like getting lost in that, in like the empathetic response. It's like, I feel like it's very hard to figure out how to talk about it with the kids. Like, my parents are going to die. I'm going to die. When should we talk about it with them? And what sort of psychological safeguards can I help put in place now so that they're equipped, maybe better than I am, hopefully better than I am, to have these internal dialogues or discuss with each other or with their spouses or partners how to best go about taking care of our estates and our affairs when we pass. And then because this was a brother of a friend that passed, I wrestled with this guy in high school. It was very close, and he is so young. It really brought it home because we've been wrapped up in this move, and there's been so much going on. All I can think about is building furniture and unpacking boxes. And then this happens, and I'm like, I gotta hug my kids more. Am I doing it enough? Am I paying attention to them enough as a parent? Will they remember me well when I die? And it's like, oh my gosh, it's almost too much to think about. And I'm not even a member of the family that this happened to. Yeah. And it becomes very difficult, I think, as secular folk, like you were saying, because one of the things that we lose upon leaving religion is that community, for good or bad. Whether the community is positive or negative, ultimately, you do lose that community and that support system. Because even negative communities, like some of the religious ones we talk about here, they do, in times of crisis, offer a lot of empathy toward the in-group that can save lives itself. It can help people parse their grief out from potentially like negative actions they could take for like self-harm or whatever, or self-indulgent behavior that might get out of control. And I don't know, like I really want to get involved in the secular community here where we live now, because there is a very strong one, more and more, because I think that there need to be, like, the community needs to be as broad as possible. And since we're new here and we are a new voice, I think that matters. But there needs to be as broad a support system for us as secular folk, because, we don't like, what is it in Jewish cultures, sitting Shivas? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Right? And the Catholics are big on this too. Like, everybody brings a casserole, the wake. Oh, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And there needs to be like, I think a tradition, a secular tradition of a wake, with the internet and podcasts and books and everything. Like, we have so much media outreach now as secular voices that it kind of behooves us to start to introduce a new paradigm where we can talk about it, where we can have support, where I could have like, talking to the Secular Therapy Project, like talking to somebody that I can say, you know what, I'm having a hard time dealing with the death of somebody in my orbit who is so close in age to me, and I have kids, and like, it's just a lot of swirl, and it's hard to figure out where to attack the feelings from, or even if attacking the feelings is the right terminology.
Yeah, I know what you mean. As far as like, there are sort of religious cultural norms about what happens when someone dies, right? So I grew up in an Irish Catholic community. I'm very familiar with the wake that you speak of. There was often bowling involved as well.
Bowling.
Yeah. Beer and bowling was like the very common for like an elderly relative. So you'd have the wake, which is before the funeral, and that's a smaller family gathering without necessarily a ton of structure, sometimes a receiving line. If they're doing things with caskets, that might be involved. And then they have the service usually the following day. And then typically the casseroles begin, or the hot dish if you're from the Midwest, right? But one thing that I learned when I was chatting with, folks who'd experienced grief, because I really wanted to get this right. So I talked to specialists, I talked to neurologists, I talked to hospice nurses, I talked to a grief and trauma counselor, anybody who would talk to me about what was their experience, and also drew from my own experience and research and those kinds of things. But is that a lot of times, even within those faith communities, the support kind of falls away after a few weeks. And there's a general social expectation that you're going to be better by then, right? Without really realizing. So I love the idea, Pops, of coming up with what is the secular, I would call it the year of grief, right? Because it's long. Grief is forever. One of the things that we get wrong about grief is this idea that there are stages, right? And then you're at the beginning, and then you're in the middle, and now at the end, you're done. Ta-da! That's not true. Grief is something you learn to carry. But yeah, stuff like first holidays, first Father's Day, first Mother's Day, first Christmas, whatever those are, those can be super hard. And it would be really lovely to create that. Because yeah, it does happen where after about a month, people stop calling, the casseroles stop coming. I had a lovely conversation with a woman at a Renaissance festival of all places. Betsy, what? Why are you talking about Ren fairs?
I grew up at a Ren fair.
Awesome. So she traveled with the Renaissance festivals throughout. Like, she was one of the vendors that went with them. And at each festival, they go to different festivals at different times of years. You run into the same friends again and again. And it's not always the exact same group. And she had lost her spouse. And for her, going for the next year of the Ren fairs was actually fantastic, because her grief was still fresh. And every new group of people that she came to, so this month they're in this state, this month they're in that state, and they're learning about this death and they're processing the grief with her, she continued to receive that sort of level 1 support that she really needed, that we all need. That often in a traditional community is going to kind of fall away after a month or two. And she actually commented when I was chatting with her, she said how lovely it had been to have this group to carry her throughout this first year after losing her spouse. Grief lasts a long, long time. It lasts forever. It's always there. I do want to comment, though, Pops, on your notion of like sort of the administrative tasks associated with somebody. There's a financial planner who every year makes a video for his family in case something happens. And he goes through all of the accounts and all of the passwords, and the video's on a thumb drive in his drawer. And that's what he does.
Yeah, that's smart. And before I forget, really interesting point you bring up about the stages of grief, because the sense that I get, and I'll lean on your expertise greater than mine, that the concept of stages of grief and grief being managed or dispelled feels like it has more to do, in some cases, with the people in the orbit of the grieving person feeling better, and that they can release their obligation to be a caregiver for the grieving person. That it's like, I want this person to be better so I can take that off of my radar and go back to my life. And that it feels a little self-serving, or maybe sometimes a lot self-serving, that, oh no, they're good now, we don't have to worry about them anymore, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I've seen it with both. I've seen it in social aspects where people are wondering, well, why aren't they better? Right? Newsflash, they're different now. Their life is just cleaved. The person you knew is gone. This is a different person now. There's a before and there's an after. So just, buckle up. But also for the person experiencing grief, because I did a lot of surveys and a lot of people thought they were doing it wrong. They wondered what stage they were in, and then what stage was next. And they're sort of judging themselves. It's the judgment some people put upon themselves experiencing grief, as far as, am I fitting correct social norms? I feel numb. Does that mean something's wrong with me? I am so sad I can't get out of bed. Does that mean something is wrong with me? I'm going to go exercise at the gym today. I feel great. I'm going to go see a stand-up comedian. Is something wrong with me? And the answer to all those questions is no. That's all totally normal. That's totally normal. But I think that's a big benefit to being a skeptic, is we are always willing to question, and we're always willing to change our minds when we're presented with new information.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the benefits. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And like one of the ones that I worry about is, what will I do? How will I frame it when I fall in love with somebody else should moms die years down the road? Decades later, of course, the grieving process will be very long. But what will I feel? Will I accept those feelings? Or will I do that exact same thing that you were just talking about? Will I doubt the veracity of the feelings? Will I say, no, it's too soon? No, I shouldn't ever love again. Guilty feet have got no rhythm. That's interesting. Yeah, I actually encountered that with a widow that I went to high school with.
And he had started to get close to someone, and the someone he got close to was another friend of mine. And she was the one who was resistant to any kind of relationship because she thought it was too soon.
Oh.
And the truth is, nobody gets to tell you. That's our individual choice. So I think that those external social judgments in either direction are so unhelpful for people who are experiencing grief. Now, you certainly see some unhealthy patterns that you're like, well, you seem to serially do the same, have the same relationship pattern again and again that ends up being an unhealthy thing. And to me, that's sort of a separate thing. But I don't necessarily think there's not a right or wrong answer as far as if someone experiences the loss of a partner and then has a new romantic relationship, it is what it is.
I mean, this brings up such an interesting point because I feel like there's this cultural assumption that religion makes grief easier. And I was just thinking about that because I don't, it's like, well, if you believe in a religion, then you believe in an afterlife. And so you have this easy answer that you'll be able to see the person again and that somehow is going to lessen grief. And I was just listening to this podcast. It's a Christian father who does it. It's called Dad Tired. And he actually just had an episode about kids and grief. And I was like, oh man, I got to listen to this before we talk. And I, as far as the afterlife, I was just thinking about it because that's only true if the majority of your social circle is of your religion and actively practicing. Because he was very open in that podcast. He's like, the hardest thing as a Christian preacher to do is a funeral for somebody who is not a believer. Because they're not in heaven in your belief. I was thinking, if we converted and became Christians, if we found God and became Christians, most of the people in our kids' orbit would not be saved. There would be none of that comfort, right? Because almost everybody we know would not be going to whatever good afterlife there is based on anything we join. It was just our circle is broad enough that there's nothing we could choose where that would be a general comfort. And then thinking about the remarriage question, I've been very open with Pops that he should definitely, feel free to find somebody else. If I keel over, don't feel bad about it. Live the best life you can live, whatever that looks like after me. But again, that's such a more difficult question if you think your spouse is looking down on you.
Oh, think about if you're
reunited with, I just feel like it's just hard for everybody. And we've been fed this lie that religion is a great thing that makes death easy. And I sort of feel like it's just not easy.
Well, there's polygamy in heaven. That's why it's
I was going to say, if you're Mormon and the family is sort of sealed, I don't even know I don't know how that all shakes out. I don't know.
Yeah.
I do think though, when we think about is the idea of an afterlife comforting, I don't
know.
The example that I'll give is some young kids in our extended family who were attending a memorial service for their beloved grandfather who had passed away. And their family is quite religious. And so some of the instruction that they had received from the religious leader was, you should be so happy that your grandpa is in heaven with Jesus. And these children are sad because their grandpa is not here with them. And they're not thinking this yet, but they probably will when they're older, is who's this jerk who took my grandpa away? And why am I supposed to be grateful for that? So these kids are crying because they're so sad about their grandfather at this service, but they have these smiles pasted on their faces because they have received so much positive social feedback about being happy about grandpa being with Jesus. So it was almost putting them in a space of having to not have the feelings that they were having, right? They were kind of in a place of cognitive dissonance, which I think that's a thing that heaven kind of forces on you. Like, it sounds, I wonder if it's more about the entropy of the universe associated with our death and the fact that the atoms that are me will no longer be quite so organized and available. And maybe I don't want to think about that part. And maybe it just feels easier to think that they're a whole being just in a place I cannot reach or see or touch. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But I personally don't know that. For me, the afterlife obviously does not bring comfort because I don't believe in it. But I also wonder how much comfort it actually brings to a believer who is faced with, my spouse is not here beside me, cracking their funny jokes or whatever. Yeah, I struggle with that one.
Well, I think depending on your denomination and the afterlife version you believe in, we're talking about Christianity here, that heaven itself requires cognitive dissonance, like to being there. Just because the text says there is no suffering in heaven, which means that if you're there, which we've talked about on the podcast before, right, moms? Like if you're there and you're looking down on your loved ones, some of whom might not be believers, then they go to hell for disbelief. Then you're not suffering because you're not sad that they're being tortured forever. Or are you sad, or do you have free will, or is there no free will in heaven? It's like it's sold as this really easy comfort, but it's actually this like rat's nest of problems theologically that just get pasted over with but you're going to be with God, so it's going to be good. And then the conversation has to end there, because any further conversation starts to pick away at the layers until you're left with, I don't know, deconstruction. Yeah.
It's like heaven is like sort of comfortably numb, associated with like drug use or something like that. Like it's that total disassociation of like, I'm great. I don't care. Awesome.
And that feels selfish, right? Like, I got mine, screw you sort of thing. Like, I don't understand it anymore. Like I used to. I was really big on that whole thing, but I don't understand it now because I've thought about it more from a skeptical point of view.
Give me 1 second.
Oh, you're going to go do the thing?
Or could you go yell at them?
I don't want to yell at them. I'll talk to them.
Yeah,
talk loudly. Just talk loudly.
Talk loudly. We have had such an interesting parenting weekend.
Hey! Kids!
Your kids are like, they're elementary age, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, 3rd and 5th.
Right.
Yeah, mine are teenagers. So
that can also actually talked to them.
Yeah, I talked to them about this. I was like, what do you think adults should know? I asked them, what do you think adults should know about kids experiencing grief?
Oh, wow. What did they say?
Cool.
Yeah.
One of the things they talked about, that it's a thing we talk about a lot, and you probably speak with your kids about this as well, is that children are sometimes not respected by adults as whole beings with rights. And that often their feelings are dismissed because they're young. They're too young to understand or something like that.
They're incomplete.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And so I talked with them a little bit about that. And they also mentioned that kids, when they have experienced grief, which my kids candidly haven't experienced a ton of close grief. But yeah, just that they felt like sometimes people got ignored. They got swept under the rug. They kind of got patted on the head. It'll be okay. Or even distracted from what was true.
Yeah.
And somewhat dismissed, which I
like
thought
that
was
rainbow
really
bridge thing. Like when a pet dies, there's a rainbow bridge. Kibbles is in heaven for dogs or whatever. Yeah.
But they had the same questions about if they're doing it wrong. Like when I was chatting with one of my teenagers today, we were talking about, he was reflecting on the different grief experiences that he's had, and that the death of our family dog was probably the thing that hit him the hardest, as opposed to other like sort of tangential adults in his life or that sort of thing. And he wondered, like, does that make me a bad person that I am sadder about the dog? And I was like, well, no, the dog was closest to you and she was awesome. Yeah. Like, you knew we're the best. But yeah, no, kids go through the same kinds of things.
Well, this I wanted to ask about, because I would say the book is mainly focused on the adult experience. I was actually paging through it last night, and I still think there's a ton that applies to kids really well. So I was thinking there's a section about self-talk, and a lot of what you go through in that. I'm like, these, some of these are things I've said to my kids about hard times. I think that's like so applicable and helpful, having those things to go back to. You talk about physical movement, which I think might be even more important for kids and adults sometime. You were talking about like art. Man, like art with kids can just be so powerful. But I think there are some differences too. And I think your son expressed it so well, because I think for a lot of families, I just don't think kids' experiences and emotions are sometimes given the weight that adults are. So if they're having a really hard time, they're just like not given. I mean, we do a bad, like we were saying, like we do a bad job with adults, right? We don't give adults enough grace to take the time they need to experience these things, but it's even worse for kids. And I'm so glad we're talking with you now, because I mean, we've been so lucky, but like this year has been interesting for us, and like doing a major move where they had to leave their friends. Like, there are the very traditional forms of grief that we think about, but then
homesickness is a form of grief.
But like that sort of experience of loss that you can't get back, I think applies to a lot more than just like the death experience, for sure. But I was thinking about it because I feel like I am not perfect at this. And I often feel like I'm not giving them enough grace. And I was thinking about that because I do really appreciate the emotions they have. But I think there is, I was trying to think about what it was for me. And I think a little bit is like, kids are so amazingly resilient at times. We went through this move, and, and like there have been moments of sadness, there have been moments of intense homesickness, but like they've made new friends. They're like jumping in, they're enjoying things. And I think there is a trap in that, where like when you see how resilient kids can be, where there's like, well, but you've just gotten through this before, and I think there's a little bit of that, where like you can sort of be lulled into a sense of like, oh, they can just like bounce back. Like that's just what they do. So when that's not happening, it's kind of hard because they've shown their ability to do it so much, if that makes any sense. And also, I think as a parent, like there's a very weird thing about going through a situation of grief with your children, because you're both experiencing it yourself and then also having to manage it for somebody else. And I feel like depending on what the kid is like there's a level, like particularly with young kids, there's like a level of processing that needs to happen where like they just need to talk about it a lot more, because it's not only all of the feelings that we need to go through, but like for a lot of different situations, like they also have to process it to understand it in a way that we don't. And so it's like not even managing the emotions, which are so hard, but like also having to manage, like it can be hard for us. And then having somebody who like needs to talk about it a lot, to be like, yes, this person is really gone, or like, yes, we're never going to be living in that house again, or like, and so it's at a time where like, because adults deal with it in all different ways. Like if you just want to have a moment to like be beyond it, to have to be like narrating it again and again for another person, it can be really difficult.
Yeah, especially small people. One frame that I think is interesting that I think it was a neurologist described was, our brains have these sort of maps in them. So when you move, like, because we did the cross-country move as well, and your brain has a map and you can autopilot around inside your house. I can walk around my house in the dark. I can get all the way to the kitchen sink. I can get a glass of water. I can go back to bed. And when you're experiencing grief, like you have this huge change, like you physically move to a different house, you don't have a map of that house yet, right? And so you have to rebuild a map. And I feel like sometimes, particularly with young kids, when they're talking about it a lot, that's one of the ways they're building their new map, right? Because their brain now has to map that this thing is no longer here, but my world has to now kind of remap around it. It's an interesting way to kind of frame it for ourselves. I will say my own kids with our big family move. I was chatting with my older kids. So we're 2 years in now after making a big move. And I was chatting with one of my oldest kids about it. And he came in. He came into my room and he's like, "Hey, I want to talk to you." He's like, I'm feeling kind of sad. I was just remembering when we lived in our old neighborhood and basically the life that I had there. And I was feeling nostalgic about it and like a little sad about it. And the loss for him is also knowing like you can't go home again. Like even if we moved right back into that house on the same street, a lot of the neighbors have moved. People's lives have changed. You're never, that season has ended. So it kind of doesn't matter. And I think that for him was hard to think about because he also is really happy with his new life. Like jumped into new activities, has a bunch of new friends, is doing things in our new community that he didn't have access to in our last community. And it's such a tension of feelings, that nostalgia feeling plus the feeling of I enjoy this new thing, but I cannot have both of them. And just having some squishy feelings there.
Feeling guilt, perhaps, about being happy, which is part of grief, right? Do I deserve happiness? Like, what have I done to earn this new positive set of feelings when I really should be so sad about losing everything that was before?
Yeah. But what new opportunities have emerged?
Yeah.
That I didn't have before.
That's something that we've gone through. We actually been talking about the last two episodes because my kids were heavily involved. Reader and Go were heavily involved in MMA training.
Yeah.
In our previous home, and since they've moved, they've stopped and are now doing rock climbing more and swimming more, and that's totally fine. And I want the best for them, and I'm happy that they want to pursue things that are very goal-oriented and athletic. But I had to go through my own grieving process of, now I no longer have this strong connection to their after-school activity. Like this, they are no longer doing this thing that featured so prominently in my own youth. And so I had to get over that too. And it's very interesting how I found, wait, am I like grieving the loss of this part of this relationship that I had with them? And I realized I was. Thankfully, it was relatively minor, but it nonetheless happened and I had to deal with it. And we talked about it, and talking about it on the podcast helped too. So thank you everybody for allowing that. But
like, I'm wondering, thinking about the book and thinking about kids, is there anything that you would particularly go back to or want to add, thinking about kids in grief versus adults in grief?
When I think about kids, one of the things that I see a lot that gives me pause is bodily autonomy. And I think that it's really important to make sure that if a child is experiencing grief, I mean, we do this with our kids, I think most of the time, but you have autonomy over all things. Your body is your own. It doesn't belong to anyone else. It's yours. And when you're experiencing grief, you're going to go through things. People are going to want to give you a hug. Maybe you don't want a hug. but people feel like that's the appropriate social response to grief. And you don't have to accept that hug, and it doesn't make you weird or nothing, anything. Like, so I feel like that. And I think also kind of preparing them for all the other external social things they're going to encounter. So if you're a child who does not believe in the idea of heaven and is not interested in having someone pray for you, knowing that people are going to come at you with this in a way that you may never have experienced it before, right? And I talk about this in the book because it happens to any non-believer.
Yeah.
But just to be prepared for all of those things, everything from whatever the service or whatever the end of life, whatever those rituals are going to be. I think that's really important. If it's somebody who's, not close to them, may have a different belief system. Like, we lost a dear friend to depression a few years ago, and they chose to have open casket at the service. I did not know it was open casket. My kids knew this was a thing. And I told them, I said, sometimes this is a thing. I don't think they're going to do that, but I don't want you to be surprised. And I will do my best to tell you if I find out before you do. So if you want, I'll go scout it out first, so you know. And they didn't. Yeah. And they did end up having an open casket. And so being able to tell them ahead of time or give them the choice to not go. You don't have to go. That's not like there's this idea that like, oh, you'll be so sad that you weren't there. I don't believe that's true. You made the right choice for yourself at the time. Let that go. Like, you don't, like, most people don't actually even remember those services, and there's no reason to put a kid through something like that. There's no value there. It's almost like it becomes a dog and pony show of like, oh, look at these little children. Like, I have a problem with that. And I think as an adult who's supporting a kid, I think you need to have that conversation with yourself to make sure you're setting good boundaries for them and you're setting them up to be safe, to be psychologically safe through the experience. And I would also say for a parent or caregiver who's, supporting a child with grief is to set yourself up with some support. Someone that you trust who can help you out, because you're going to help this small person deal with this really big thing. And you yourself might be falling apart. And you're allowed to fall apart, but maybe bring in, have one of your close siblings or friends come and maybe even stay with you for a few weeks if they're able to keep the rhythm of the day moving, right? So that the laundry is getting done and the meals are being prepared and the rhythm of the day is still intact for these young people. If you yourself are just not capable, you're not able to do it at that time, and accept that it's okay. It's heavy. It's real heavy. And you don't know how it's going to hit you. You just don't know day to day, week to week, how it's going to hit. So I think that's important. I think making sure the kids have some good boundaries. I think another opportunity that I've seen work well is insulating them in their social situations. So we had a child in our school system who lost a parent very suddenly. And the school district did a fantastic job of setting up the whole school around her.
Oh, wow.
So they cherry-picked her classmates of kids they knew she got along well with. They cherry-picked her teachers, the teachers that would be like the most gentle and kind and caring. They kept it tight and small so she was not overwhelmed. They told her ahead of time, if you need to leave the classroom because you need to leave the classroom, this is what you do. You don't have to ask permission. You get up, you go. These are the safe spaces for you in the building. These are the people you can go and talk to. So you can go sit in the school nurse's office. They set that all up ahead of time for her, and they were prepared. So they cut back on her assignments and got her support so that she could still have the sort of normalcy of school and social while still dealing with the grief of losing a parent. So all of those things, it was so heartwarming for me to see how quickly the community came together to support her.
I mean, I think that, because I was trying to think through something, and you talking about bodily autonomy and that kind of safety brings together two things that I was having thoughts about. Because I think the other hard thing with kids is like, as adults, like we kind of, like I think in a lot of ways, like we know things are going to be weird for us when we're in these hard periods. Like, maybe I'm just going to want to eat chocolate for a day. And I can say, like, yeah, you're going through a really hard time. Like, today you're going to eat chocolate. And yeah, I know I can't do that every day. That'll become a problem, right? But, like, it's just going to be off. And this is what's going to feel good for today. And And so sort of that, but then I was also thinking like our son had this like really wild emotional breakdown like in the morning a couple of weeks ago. And Pops had to get him for school. And when they left for school, I was like, I don't know if he's going to make it to school. Like, I was like, is he going to like run into an intersection? Because he was just,
oh gosh,
like he was just like, like there was some regulation and they were fine. And Pops managed it. And there were some tricky moments, but he made sure things were safe. So I think it's both a mix of like, and it sounds like the school played the perfect sort of balance where I think it can be hard to let our kids have that weirdness, which like they're going to need as well. I think as parents, we sort of want to keep things steady. And so it can be hard to be like, they're not going to bed. Well, it might be really hard for them to go to bed in this difficult moment, and leaving space for things to be weird for them, the way I think we have an easier time leaving space for things to be weird for us, while at the same time maintaining safety. Because on the other hand, kids don't necessarily have those boundaries in their heads to be like, yes, I ate chocolate all of yesterday, but I truly can't do that today because I'm going to be physically ill,
Yeah.
So like, I think that's a really sort of beautiful mix of those things of being like, we're going to make everything safe, but we're also going to like leave room for you when things aren't going to be normal for you to have space to manage that.
Yeah. With our kids, we have they know that they can take a mental health day if they need to. That's just a thing in our family. Like, one of my kids is in middle school. Middle school can be really hard. Sometimes kids aren't nice and sometimes it's just a lot and you just need a day to just hang out and lay in bed while mom is at work or whatever. And that's the thing we talk to them about. Like if they're having a rough day for them, they can still make up the schoolwork and it's better for them to take the mental health day than to just go like, your kid's best. But yeah, I think for a kid who's experiencing grief, knowing that it's okay to take a mental health day, but you can't like kind of completely check out. Yeah, I also feel like for parents, it's also good, parents and caregivers, to think about how you want to have those conversations and not be overly descriptive in, if they're asking lots of questions about the death. Like, I think it's important to be age appropriate. So I don't think they need a vivid description of exactly what happens at the end of life. I don't think that's valuable, but making sure they understand the finality of death is also really important. And I think it's also helpful for parents to be prepared to answer questions with a question, just so they can really understand it and also can get you a beat to think about how you want to answer. Like, tell me what made you think of that. Because sometimes they'll ask questions that they feel like they're left field and they're perhaps not well phrased. Because you have to think about for yourself as that caregiver or parent, you might need a beat because your brain's probably processing things pretty slowly.
Yeah. And also, I think sometimes when you ask that question, they're not asking for as much as you think they are.
Yes, I completely agree.
That's a good
point. Like they ask a question, you're like, oh my God, they are expecting me to have like a full, philosophical view of death and the universe and everything. And what they are literally just asking is like something so much tinier than that when you drill down a little bit and you're like, oh, I can actually, this is actually very answerable. And telling them all of that would have been like maybe unhelpful.
Yeah, I think the short answers, are helpful. And then another question. Because again, we have to remember that this is not about us. It's about them. It's so hard. But they don't need the giant philosophy of anything. They just want to know we won't see Grandpa again. Yeah. We can remember Grandpa with videos and pictures, but we will not see him again. And it's okay to feel sad about that. And we can talk about it anytime.
Yeah, you could also throw it back to them and say, does that answer your question? Or is there anything else you want to ask about? Because I am that person, as moms knows, that I'll just start talking and I'll just weave a tapestry of answers. I'll try to cover all the bases, and then they'll either check out or they'll glaze over. But not always, but still, it's like sometimes it is too much, and they like shorter, pithy answers don't lead to that overkill. And it is so important that they have that opportunity to process the big emotions. And so a little nugget, and then you back off, and then they process, and then you ask, does that answer your question? Is probably a more appropriate response that I'm going to work on doing more moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, Reader makes it easy because Reader will just walk away. Like you can be in the middle of the most like profound diegesis.
And I'll be like, and we're done.
Yeah.
He's like, I got what I needed here. Thanks.
No, but Go, to his credit, will stay engaged and ask follow-up questions. You can get as deep as you want. So definitely different kids in that regard.
Yeah. And it's like, your child, right? Mm-hmm. You know your child. So if you think about how well you know your child, like this is what's probably going to be best for them. And it's going to be different for your different children, right? Yeah. So equal, being fair does not always mean being equal as far as this is what I know is going to be best for you. And this is what I know is going to be best for you. Yeah. Because my older kid is definitely going to dive in a little deeper. And my younger kid is also going to be like, got what I needed. See you later.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about it with your book, because one of the things I think is so impressive, just like for everybody, is, when we've been emailing and talking, I feel like we're both people who like love digging into things and like thinking about all the ins and outs. And maybe the thing that I liked most about the book was how simple and digestible it was. And I have to imagine that was incredibly intentional. And
yes,
it was actually like one of the biggest things I took away from it. Because I was like, oh, you got it. Like when you are in grief, you can't process at the same level.
Yep.
Like
it was very intentional.
Yeah. And I was just like, and I was reading it at a time where like I wasn't in particular grief, but it was like, oh yeah, this is what, you can't expect your brain to be doing the same thing in these moments that it would be doing at other times.
Yeah, I definitely, I actually worked in educational publishing for about a decade, and language acquisition, language level, language learning, all of those things were a huge part of my day to day. And so I did really aim for short, tight sentences, very digestible. Don't go, because grief brain means you need it to be short. The chapters need to be short. The paragraphs need to be short so you can take the pieces. And I also wanted you to be able to open it up to any particular section. Like, I can't sleep. Boom. Here's what you need to know. Mm-hmm. I didn't want it to be something because somebody experiencing grief, it could be difficult for them to go all the way from the beginning, all the way to the end of like 165 pages. Like that's a lot. Mm-hmm. So I wanted it to be. So thank you. I'm glad that it worked. I'm glad you noticed, and I'm glad that it worked because that was definitely the intent.
So this has been so amazing. I feel like we're going to have to come back to this all again because I'm going to think about this and be like, oh, but we didn't talk about this or that. And I know this is going to speak to people. So I assume we're going to get questions and other things too.
Awesome.
But I did want to give you a chance to talk about the other amazing stuff you do because you have this like beautiful shop. Our family members are getting things from it for the holidays. We can't say what or who, but I wanted you to be able to talk about that a little bit because it's a totally different resource that you provide, which is so amazing.
Yeah. So Betsy DeVille, I actually started on Etsy, and then I started my own website a couple of years ago. And really, I just create delightful secular things for delightful secular people, right? So I love the place where science meets art. That's the intersection where I really love to play around. So I love to play around with things like Charles Darwin's original tree that he drew with his original theory of evolution and turning that into a Christmas tree with some of the things that Charles Darwin loved, or looking at a phylogenetic tree, which is a diagram of evolution, and mixing that with stained glass and turning that into a Christmas ornament, or taking secular quotes and arranging them on a scarf. Yeah, I love to play in that space. And one of the things that I really enjoy is looking back through the centuries at freethinkers and some of their early writings that people act like atheism is this big new thing, but y'all, it's been around longer than anyone knows. And so I love going back and really enjoying those writings and hearing the stories about people like Frances, the Red Harlot of Infidelity, and her speaking circuit. Isn't that the best name ever?
Yes.
I know. So how dare women have rights and bodily autonomy? And some of the wonderful characters throughout history. I really enjoy that space. So yeah, I do a lot of jewelry. I do a lot of Christmas. I do T-shirts. I do accessories. I do home decor. But yeah, I'm actually coming at you live from the studio here, which is where all the magic happens.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I would highly encourage people to check it out.
Yes, you can find Betsy DeVille on Etsy. You can find Betsy DeVille at betsydeville.com. And if you want to check out Grief for Atheists, you can buy it pretty much anywhere you buy books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, that sort of a thing. You can also find it on my website. Yeah. And if you want me to come and talk to your group about grief, let me know, because I do that too.
That's amazing. And there's like a grief package on the website too, right?
Yes, I just launched a secular grief care package. So it's all evidence-based. It includes a copy of Grief for Atheists and a lot of evidence-based care items that you could send to somebody who's experiencing grief. In fact, I just launched that product this week, and I have a survey out. I'd love to hear what your listeners think about it. And I'm actually going to give away a bracelet from anyone who is able to participate in that survey. It's about 7 questions, and I have you look at the product listing and just give me your honest opinions about what you think. So I welcome folks to do that as well.
Awesome. We will post that link in the show notes.
Thank you.
And I just want to remind people, like we were talking about, grief doesn't end. So like, if there is someone in your life, it doesn't have to be for somebody who experienced something traumatic yesterday. This can be an amazing thing to just let somebody know, even though it's been a little while. Maybe nobody's checked in with them.
Yeah, it is important to check in on your friends who are experiencing grief, because it doesn't go away. The students that I mentioned in school, I'm still in touch with their families. And it means a lot to them to see that nobody has forgotten about their kids.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I know we went a little bit long, but there was just too much good stuff in there that I couldn't cut it all out. So I hope that was fun. And to wrap it up, we have to say thank you to Jonathan Zalben and First Frame Music for the music for this podcast.
And that ends this episode of The Family Skeptical, where nothing is sacred except for our kids.
Pops, I see you have the curtains that y'all had on Instagram.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think you ever look, you have no idea what I do on social media, right, babe?
No.
It's all a mystery.
I don't listen to the podcasts. I don't look at any of the social media engagement. I just come, I say words, I occasionally listen better than I talk, and then I bug out.